Let me start with a question. Think about the last time someone made you feel genuinely confused. Not angry, not hurt, but confused. The kind of confusion where you kept replaying the conversation in your head, trying to figure out where the floor disappeared from under you. Someone who said all the right things, made you feel seen, maybe even special, and then did something that just did not add up. And when you tried to reconcile those two versions of the same person, you couldn't. The math didn't work. You kept checking your own perception, wondering if you were the problem. Hold on to that feeling, because that's what this episode is about. I'm Adrian. I'm a combat veteran. I served with 1st Infantry Division during the Baghdad Surge. I spent 6 years as a law enforcement officer in Iowa, and right now I'm studying psychology at Portland State University with the long-term goal of working in veteran mental health. I've spent a significant portion of my adult life around people in extreme situations, people in crisis, people in custody, people doing the worst things human beings do to each other. I thought I had a pretty good read on people, and then I started reading Robert Hare. Hare is a criminal psychologist who spent his career, decades of it, studying psychopathy. Not the Hollywood version, not the brilliant cannibal in an expensive suit, but the real thing. And what I want to do today is walk through the opening chapter of his book, Without Conscience, because I think it does something that pure clinical description can't. It shows you how this works, not as a concept, as an experience. Hare opens his book with something I found immediately compelling. He describes what happens when he talks about his work at dinner parties. He'll sketch out the characteristics of a psychopath. For someone curious about his research, and almost without fail, someone at the table goes quiet. They look up and say something like, "Good Lord, I think my brother-in-law might be one of these people," or "I've never been able to explain my ex-husband to anyone, but you just described him exactly." That moment, that recognition, that's what Hare is after in this chapter. He says that people call his laboratory all the time, not researchers, not clinicians, but regular people, trying to understand a husband, a child, an employer, someone whose behavior has been causing them pain for years, and they have never been able to name it. They just knew that something was wrong. They just couldn't put a finger on it. That's the phrase that Hare uses, and it's the one I keep coming back to. Something's wrong here, but I can't quite put my finger on it. That's the experience he wants to give you before he gives you the framework. And he does it through 3 stories. We're going to go through all of them today. The first one is Ray. In the early 1960s, Hare finished his master's degree in psychology and needed work. He had a wife, an infant daughter, and graduate school ahead of him. He found a job at a maximum security prison in British Columbia. He had never been inside of a prison before, and he had no practical experience as a psychologist, no mentor, no training program. He walked into the prison completely cold. His office was enormous, isolated at the top of the building, behind several sets of locked doors, and on the wall above his desk was a red button, an emergency button. A guard told him, if you ever need to press it, don't expect help to arrive quickly. That details matters, so hold on to it. He had been in his office less than an hour when his first client arrived. Tall, slim, dark-haired. Hare describes the air around this man as seeming to buzz. And the eye contact, he said it was so direct, so unrelenting, that he found himself wondering if he had ever truly looked anyone in the eye before. Most people soften their gaze, brief glances away, small moments of release. This man did not do that. Without waiting for an introduction, the inmate, Hare calls him Ray, opened with, "Hey, Doc, how's it going? Look, I've got a problem. I need your help, and I'd really like to talk to you about this." Hare, who was eager to begin his real therapeutic work, asked him to go on. Ray pulled out a knife. He held it in front of Hare's face, smiling, with that same unrelenting eye contact. Hare's first instinct was to reach for the red button, clearly visible, clearly within reach, and clearly within Ray's line of sight, but he didn't push it. Maybe because he sensed that Ray was testing him. Maybe because he understood that if Ray actually intended to hurt him, the button wasn't going to save him. Either way, he held still. Ray explained that the knife wasn't for Hare, but it was for another inmate, someone who had been making unwanted advances toward his, as Hare puts it, protege. Here's what Hare had just done and why it matters. By not reporting the knife, which Hare was absolutely required to do under prison rules, Hare had violated a fundamental regulation. Ray had set a trap, and a trained psychologist with a brand new master's degree walked right into it. In one move, Ray had identified Hare as someone who could be worked, someone who would prioritize professional rapport over procedure, someone who could be made to feel that the rules were negotiable if the relationships were at stake. And that's not an impulsive behavior, it's a test, sophisticated, deliberate, and almost immediately successful. From that point on, Hare says, 8 months at the prison, miserable. The manipulation wasn't dramatic. It didn't need to be. Ray worked through ordinary human levers of ambition, sympathy, professional identity, and he convinced Hare that he had a passion for cooking, a natural talent, a plan for when he got out, so he wanted to transfer to the kitchen. Hare supported it. What Hare didn't consider, what Ray had certainly considered, was that the kitchen was a source for sugar, potatoes, and fruit, the raw materials for alcohol. Months later, there was an explosion directly beneath the warden's dining table. And when the smoke cleared, investigators found an elaborate distilling operation under the floors. Ray was the architect of it. Let that image sit for a second. A still, under the warden's table, not just in defiance of the institution, directly beneath its authority. That's not just criminal ingenuity, that is a statement. Ray spent his time in solitary, and then he walked into Hare's office as if nothing had happened, and asked for a transfer to the auto shop. Hare, still stinging from the kitchen disaster, eventually relented again. Before Hare left the prison to pursue his doctorate, Ray nearly talked him into asking his own father, who was a roofing contractor, to offer Ray a job as part of a parole application. When Hare mentioned this to the other prison staff, they laughed. Not unkindly. They'd all been there. They'd all been taken in at some point. Over time, experience had filed down their trust into something harder. Hare had mistaken that for cynicism, but he came to understand that it was calibration. But the Ray story doesn't end there. And this is the part that has stuck with me. Years later, Hare is at the university, his faculty position after finishing his PhD, and it's registration week. He's sitting at a table processing student paperwork, and he hears from the next line over someone saying his name. Yes, I worked for Dr. Hare's assistant. I worked as Dr. Hare's assistant at the penitentiary the whole time he was there. I did all his paperwork for him. I filled him in on prison life. Sure, he used to talk over hard cases with me all the time. We worked great together. It was Ray, standing in the registration line, posing as a former research assistant to a faculty member he spent 8 months manipulating at a university. Hare broke in. Oh, really? Ray didn't even flinch. Hey, Doc, how's it going? And he simply pivoted, took the conversation in a different direction. When Hare later checked Ray's application, his academic transcripts were fraudulent. Here's what Hare says fascinates him the most. Ray remained absolutely unflappable, even after his deceit was revealed. No embarrassment, no scramble to recover. He just redirected, the way water redirects around a stone in the creek. No scramble to recover. He just redirected. The obstacle wasn't a problem. It was a feature of the terrain. Hare says that encounter is what focused his next 25 years of research. What in someone's psychological makeup gives them the power to override reality, apparently without compunction, without concern? That's the question, and it's a good one. But before we move to the next case, I need to tell you about the car. When Hare left the prison for university, he traded his Ford to a corrections officer for an older Morris Minor. He took advantage of the prison's policy of allowing staff to have vehicles serviced in the institution's auto shop, where Ray still worked. The car got a beautiful paint job. The motor was reconditioned. Everything looked good. Hare loaded up all of his family's possessions, put his infant daughter in a makeshift bed in the back seat, and headed across the country to Ontario. Not long after leaving Vancouver, the motor started running rough. Then the radiator boiled over. A mechanic found ball bearings in the carburetor's float chamber and noticed a radiator hose that had been deliberately tampered with. So, those got fixed. Then, descending a long hill, I bet you know what's going to happen here. The brake pedal went soft, and then it hit the floor. No brakes, long hill, family in the car. They did, however, make it to a service station. The mechanic found a cut brake line, sliced in a way that would cause a slow, gradual leak. Not immediate failure, but delayed failure. Time to happen on the road, far from the prison, far from anyone who could point a finger. Hare says he has no doubt the prison telegraph had told Ray, who now owned the car. That's not impulsive rage. It's patient, methodical, and almost invisible. Ray wasn't there when it happened. He may have been in solitary or in another part of the facility. The act had a long fuse, a car moving down a mountain road, brakes failing, plausible deniability, built right in. I've worked law enforcement, I've served in combat, and I know what it feels like to recognize a threat that was designed to look like an accident. That detail about the brake line is the one that changes the register of the whole story. Ray isn't just charming and manipulative. He's dangerous in a cold, deliberate, and pre-planned way. Now, let's move to a different setting. Elsa met Dan at a laundromat in London. She was there on a year's sabbatical from teaching, recovering from a difficult divorce. She's been lonely. The city was gray, and she didn't know anyone. Dan was warm, funny, and immediately familiar. The kind of person who makes you feel like you've known them for years within the first hour. He said he was a translator for the United Nations between assignments. He was in every way that mattered in that first conversation, exactly what someone lonely and open would want to find. He forgot his wallet on the first dinner. She paid. They started seeing each other constantly, and he gradually moved into her flat, and she was surprised to find that she loved it. It wasn't like her, she said, but after months of solitude, she was having the time of her life. But there were things that she pushed out of her mind. He never invited her to his place. She never met any of his friends. Strange items started appearing in her apartment. A carton of tape recorders, factory wrapped, 3 televisions stacked in the corner. Storing them for a friend, he said. When she pushed for more, he just shrugged. One day, he didn't show up where he was supposed to be, so she assumed an accident. For after all, he was always crossing streets mid-block. And then, 3 days later, she came home to find him asleep in her bed, smelling of stale beer and someone else's perfume. When she asked where he'd been, he told her to never ask that again. Where I go, what I do, who I do it with, it doesn't concern you, Elsa. So don't ask. And then, and this is the move that I think Hare finds the most clinically revealing, Dan softened. He reached out to her and he said, I know it hurts you, but think of jealousy like the flu and just wait to get over it. And you will, baby. You will. Hare describes this as a mother cat licking her kitten. A grooming behavior, not comfort, management. And he notes that Elsa herself noticed. There was something in that metaphor, jealousy as a flu, that told her he had never actually felt the pain of a broken trust. He was describing her emotional experience from the outside, clinical, detached, using the language of empathy without the architecture of it. The relationship ended abruptly. One evening, she asked him casually, lightly, if he'd go out and get her an ice cream. He stared at her, and then he said in a strange, snide voice, "Always got everything you wanted, didn't you? Any little thing Elsa wanted, someone always jumped up and ran out and bought it for you." She was bewildered. She said nothing that could have provoked that. He stood up, walked out, and she never saw him again. No explanation, no argument, no ending, really just a disappearance, like a door closing on a room that was never quite what it appeared to be. The last case is the one I find the hardest. Helen and Steve had twin daughters, fraternal, but physically similar. Same parents, same home, same resources, entirely different trajectories. Ariel was the one they had toasted with uncomplicated pride. She'd had her struggles, adolescent moods, a lost year after college, but she'd found her footing, went to law school, made law review, graduated with honors, and was now on a path to partnership. She was exactly what most parents hoped for. Alice was, as Helen puts it, something a little off. Even as a toddler, something was different. By 3 or 4, Alice had figured out how to use her looks and her cuteness to get what she wanted in ways that felt calculated, deliberately so, for a child that age. Helen felt guilty noticing it. She felt even guiltier when the family's kitten turned up dead in the yard, strangled. Ariel was devastated. Alice's tears seemed, in Helen's words, a little forced. As they grew, the dynamic between the twins hardened. Ariel defended. Alice attacked and seemed to enjoy it. She took particular pleasure in destroying her sister's things. And when Alice left the house at 17, Hare notes, it was a relief. At least Ariel could breathe. But leaving home meant Alice found drugs, and then everything accelerated. Theft, prostitution, bail, expensive treatment programs. One clinic in New Hampshire ran 30 days at $10,000. Helen and Steve lost count of how many times they'd wired money, arranged flights, and made calls. On the twins' 30th birthday, Hare describes Helen and Steve sitting across from each other with that familiar mix of gratitude and dread. Ariel had called with good news. Alice's floor counselor at the halfway house had called to say she had disappeared again. What gets me about this story is the question Helen carries for 30 years. She spent those 3 decades in what Hare calls intense self-scrutiny, going back through every decision, every interaction, every possible failure of parenting. She knew other families. She'd been careless. She'd seen careless parents with stable kids, and she knew that she and Steve weren't blatantly abusive. But she couldn't explain Alice. 30 years of doctors, psychiatrists, treatment counselors, and social workers, and not one of them had given her an explanation, let alone an answer. And so on that birthday, she and Steve looked at each other and asked the question that lives at the center of this whole subject. Is she crazy or just plain bad? I want to sit with that question for a moment before we close, because I think that question, crazy or bad, is the wrong frame, and I also think it's an almost inevitable one. When we can't explain behavior, we reach for one of 2 buckets, illness or evil, medicine or morality. And for decades, psychopathy fell into an uncomfortable gap between the 2 categories that neither framework handled well. What Hare spent his career doing, and what the PCL, the psychopathy checklist he developed, represents, is building a 3rd framework, one that's empirical, one that's diagnostic without being either dismissive or deterministic, one that says this is a real pattern, it has identifiable features, it has measurable outcomes, and understands it's the precondition for responding to it effectively. That matters to me personally, not just academically. As a veteran, I've watched people I've served with disappear into systems that couldn't explain what was happening to them. As a former deputy, I've worked with people whose behavior fit patterns no one in the room had the vocabulary for. And as a psychology student, I'm starting to develop that vocabulary, and with it, an obligation. The question Helen and Steve asked on their daughter's 30th birthday deserves a better answer than the one that they got. The field has moved. The tools exist now, and the gap between what we know and what gets applied in parole boards, in treatment programs, in family systems, in clinical settings, that gap is still costing people. That's what Hare is pointing at in this first chapter. Not the dramatic cases, the ones right next to you, the ones that leave you wondering what just happened. And that's where this work begins. Thanks for being here, and I will see you next episode.